Now, you were born in South Dakota.
I was born in Avon, South Dakota, a little town of 600 people. Um, I was there a couple of years ago, and there's a sign as you go into town that says Avon 601. So they've picked up one person since I left. Of course, when I'm there, it's 602.
What was growing up in Avon, South Dakota like?
Corn, hogs, wheat, rye, barley, dairy products. It was a diversified agricultural area and a very abundant one.
Your father, you were literally a son of a preacher man.
I grew up in a parsonage. My dad was a Methodist minister. He was of Irish descent. Most of the McGoverns were devout Catholics, but my father's branch somehow ended up as Methodist. He was assigned by the church to South Dakota and spent the rest of his adult life there. He died hunting pheasants in South Dakota.
Some of the churches that he built are still standing, aren't they?
They are. My father literally was a church builder. He had carpentry skills. He knew how to put in electric wiring and plumbing. And so he would take charge of a parish that didn't have an adequate church. He'd organize the men, many of whom would volunteer their labor, and they would put up a new church, or they'd take over an old one and remodel it. And he is responsible for several churches that are still standing in South Dakota.
What you were saying before about he being part of the Protestant wing of the McGovern family, I guess there's kind of a string of contrarianism that runs way back in your background.
Well, the McGovern Irish go back to County Cavan or County Leitrim. I went there some years ago and talked to an old sheriff, a former sheriff, and he invited me to his house for dinner. I said, "What kind of people were these McGoverns?" Well, with his Irish blarney, he said, "Well, they were kind of a shifty people. Secondly, they were litigious people. They were always taking others into court, and they became their own lawyers in court." I said, "Well, Sheriff, wasn't there anything good about them?" "Well," he said, "they were all big talkers. They could get up and speak forever." So then after about a half an hour, he started to laugh, and he said, "Well, my mother was a McGovern. They're wonderful people." He said, "I was just giving you a little of the old Irish blarney." So I felt better about it after that. But I do have a big streak of Irish blood in me, a little Scotch blood too.
Growing up in South Dakota, rural South Dakota during the Depression, describe what that was like.
Well, we were all poor, and consequently we didn't know we were poor. There was nothing to compare yourself to. There weren't any rich people in South Dakota in the 1920s. The crash of the stock market in 29 signaled for most Americans the beginning of the Depression. Not so in South Dakota and the Great Plains. The Depression there began in 1920 and 21 at the end of World War I. We had gone into all-out production, plowed up land that probably never should have been plowed. And when the war ended, the markets collapsed. Corn, wheat, barley, oats, all those things went down to, you could hardly give it away. So the banks started to fail. The stores started to fail in rural America because the farmers were losing their farms. Then the drought came, then the grasshoppers. It was a difficult time, but as I say, I had a good time growing up in the 1920s and early 30s, even though the Depression was on, because everybody was pretty much in the same boat. We helped each other. I remember my dad, as a minister, sometimes would get paid with a 100-pound sack of potatoes, or 3 or 4 dressed chickens, or tomatoes, cucumbers, and so on. People didn't have money, and they had to use what they had to help each other out.
Required a certain amount of grit, a certain amount of pluck to be able to survive during those times in South Dakota.
You know, the commentator Tom Brokaw, who incidentally grew up in South Dakota, a good friend of mine, wrote this book, The Greatest Generation, which was my generation. Now, if we were the greatest generation, I'm not sure we deserve that compliment. Part of the reason was that we toughened up during the Great Depression of the 1920s and 1930s when we were going through school and getting ready to graduate from high school. Then, of course, we went off to war. It was the combination of the Depression and World War II that I think made our generation a particularly hardy and imaginative one.
You were very young when Charles Lindbergh completed his historic flight.
5 years old, but he was a hero. I was old enough to know that this was the greatest man in the world. That's what we thought at the time. To make that flight all alone across the Atlantic Ocean, the first human being to do that, he was a hero to everybody. So even at the age of 5 or 6, I knew all about Lindbergh. And I suppose if you traced it back, maybe that's where my interest in flying began.
Is there any way for people nowadays to understand the level of celebrity that Lindbergh enjoyed after that?
I don't think so. I think that the ticker tape parades, the wild celebration in Paris when he landed, we didn't have television then, but we did have newsreels at the theater, and we had radio, and we had the headlines in the press, and we had the great photographs. I can't recall anything in my lifetime that rivaled the celebrity status of Charles Lindbergh.
As a young child, really, what was it about Lindbergh that attracted you? Was it the bravery? Was it the glamour? Was it just that he was able to do this and it was so far apart from your experiences growing up?
I think it was partly his youth. He was a big, tall, gangling youth, and he did it alone. It wasn't a crew. He was in that airplane all alone, droning away over the Atlantic Ocean in both dark and sunlight. And he did it the first time. It was a great success. He had a wonderful name for the plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, I guess it was called. But I think it was sort of the lone man against the whole world, and he conquered a big piece of it as a single individual. I think that was partly that.
In The Wild Blue, Stephen Ambrose talks about how you, in 7th grade, were challenged by your gym teacher to jump over the horse and do a head first. Could you relate that story?
I was probably, I don't know, maybe 13 years old, 13 or 14, and we had a coach. He was a wonderful coach by the name of Joe Quennell. I greatly admired him, as did the other boys. We didn't have girls' athletics to speak of in those days. But we were also all afraid of him. He was a very tough taskmaster. And in our gym class, he would have us engaged in what was rather advanced tumbling exercises. And one of the things was to run at top speed across the gymnasium floor, leap over a horse, maybe 4 feet off the floor, tuck your head, and roll on the mat on the other side of the horse. I could not do that. I'd run up to that horse and I'd stand there. The whistle blew. It was Joe Quennell. "What the hell is the matter with you, Mac?" I said, "Well, Mr. Quennell, I can't do that. I just can't dive. I'll break my neck of it." He said, "You see these other boys doing that?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You know why you can't do that? You're a physical coward." God, imagine that in front of 75 or 80 guys. It just cut me right to the quick. And, for days after that, I was hurt and demoralized by that comment. I thought I had forgotten it when I got to high school. But a year later in college, when World War II came, the attack on Pearl Harbor, I was one of the first to volunteer after Pearl Harbor, and I went into what I thought was the most dangerous part of the Air Force, which was flying a bomber in combat. I think I did it in part to show Joe Quennell that I wasn't a coward. I couldn't jump over that horse. I still can't today do that. I'd break my neck, I think. But I wanted to show him I wasn't lacking in courage. That was probably a subconscious urge on my part, but I believe it was a significant one.
What was your childhood like generally?
I had a good childhood. I never doubted once the love and devotion and trustworthiness of my mother and father. They were incapable of a falsehood. They were incapable of hypocrisy. They were honest, decent, God-fearing parents who gave us everything they had. They made it possible for us to get a good education in a secure home atmosphere. There were some things that were a little difficult. My father insisted on every morning before we went to school, we had to go in the living room. All four of us children sat around with my mother and father. My father read a chapter out of the Bible and then prayed for the safety and well-being of each one of us. At the time, I felt it was kind of difficult. Looking back on it, it's probably the best thing that could have happened to me. I can still, to this day, quote verses in the Bible, probably easier than almost anyone in public life. It's that early childhood upbringing. I soaked up a lot more of the Bible than I probably realized at the time.
Do you think in America, and this is a little bit of an aside, but do you think in America nowadays we've lost a lot of that, not just the Bible, but of the daily interaction, parents and kids?
I think we have lost a lot of that daily reaction, partly because now in many families, maybe a majority, both the mother and father work outside the home. I'm not condemning that. I think it's almost necessary economically for many families these days. My mother never worked outside the home. She was always there when we left for school. She was always there when we came home. That made a difference in the way children were reared, in my opinion. I don't blame women for wanting to be emancipated from housework and getting out on their own. That's part of modern society. But we haven't quite yet figured out how to take the place of mothers and fathers in the home. Of course, my father was in the home a great deal too. His study, as he called it, was upstairs in our house. That's where he prepared his sermons. That's where he met with his parishioners. So I think that's an enrichment in childhood that we haven't quite yet figured out how to replace.
Where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
I was at home. It was a Sunday afternoon, Mitchell, South Dakota. I was a sophomore at Dakota Wesleyan University, located in my hometown. And I was taking a class in music appreciation where the instructor, Bob Brown was his name, from Oberlin College, he required us on Sunday afternoons to listen to the New York Philharmonic. And then we were supposed to write a critical review. Imagine a high school sophomore saying that, you know, we'd put down whatever came, but we'd like to have a little more percussion here and a little more violins here. We didn't know what we were talking about, but we sounded good. And that's what I was doing, trying to figure out how I would improve the New York Philharmonic. And then came the interruption, the attack on Pearl Harbor. I didn't have the foggiest notion where Pearl Harbor was. I certainly didn't know that half the American Navy were there, but we soon discovered that half the American Navy, the big battleships and other fighting ships, were sunk that day. It was a terrible blow to the military security of the country. But I could tell looking at my father's face that this was a deadly serious basis. No television then, it was just the radio reports. And somehow by the end of the afternoon, I figured I was going to be involved in war. I didn't quite know how or even how it worked, but I think by 6 o'clock that night on Sunday, December 7th, I knew I was going to be involved in war sometime in the near future.
Did that prospect scare you?
It didn't scare me entirely. It alarmed me, but I also thought it would be an important adventure. You know, there was never any doubt after that in America that we'd be involved. The next day, President Roosevelt asked for a declaration of war, and the Congress speedily voted it. I knew all the more then that I'd be involved at some stage. I figured I would volunteer, and that was the course I took rather soon.
You felt it as a personal obligation, a patriotic act, a way to prove that you weren't a physical coward?
I felt it was a patriotic duty. The country had been savagely attacked. I thought the biggest danger from what I had read still came from Nazi Germany. Japan seemed an awfully far away place, and I thought the main test would come in Europe. But I felt an obligation, yes, a patriotic obligation to join. I also wanted to demonstrate that I wasn't a slacker, that I wasn't a coward, that I wasn't afraid to lay my life on the line. And so I decided to join up as a pilot. I had taken a course at Dakota Wesleyan civilian pilot training and had learned how to fly a little single-engine plane, a little Aranca. And there were 10 of us that took that course. And so the 10 of us all decided we should sign up as pilots.
But you took the course not expecting that something like Pearl Harbor would happen. You took it just because you liked the idea of flying?
I took it because I thought the war clouds were gathering in Europe. We weren't yet involved, but I thought there was a possibility, maybe even a probability, that sooner or later the United States would be drawn into that war. And I also was intrigued with the idea of flying. After all, out in South Dakota, we didn't see very many airplanes in those days, and we still had the image of Lindbergh. We still had the glamour of going into the skies, and so there were a combination of reasons. There wasn't any Air Force then. There was the Army Air Corps and the Navy Air Corps. 10 of us borrowed 2 cars, one from the president of Dakota Wesleyan, one from the dean of Dakota Wesleyan, and took off for Omaha, where both the Navy Air Corps recruiting office and the Army recruiting office was. We weren't quite sure which one to join. When we got there, one of the guys picked up a rumor that if you went to the Army Air Corps recruiting office, they'd give you a free meal ticket to a downtown Omaha cafeteria. So on the strength of that unsubstantiated rumor and a meal ticket probably worth about $1, all 10 of us joined the Army Air Corps. It's the cheapest I've ever sold out.
It was still about a year or so, though, before you actually were taken.
It was over a year, and the reason was we didn't have the training planes, we didn't have the training airfields, we didn't have the instructors. So I stayed in college until mid-February of '43. We'd signed up right after Pearl Harbor, I think in the early part of '42. And but we weren't called until February of '43, and then I had about a year and a half training before I went overseas. We had a choice of either becoming fighter pilots or combat bomber pilots. I chose the bombers. Somehow those big 4-engine birds that I'd seen fly over South Dakota a few times captured my fancy. And I decided that's what I wanted to do, and that's what I became.
Wasn't there more glamour being a fighter pilot?
The fighter pilots were more dashing. They maneuvered around. They could go into a near vertical dive. They could shift and turn. And to some people, that had greater appeal. They weren't aloft very long at a time either. They'd run out of fuel comparatively soon, whereas bombers could stay in the air for 10 or 12 hours. There was just something about getting behind that steering gear of a big bomber with a crew of 10 men dependent on you that appealed to me. Maybe I'm a little slower than some of the fighter pilots. I greatly admired the American fighter pilots, including Joe Foss from my state, later to become governor of South Dakota. He was one of the top fighter flying aces of the war. So I admired these men very, very highly. But somehow the bombers appealed to my nature more than the fighters, and I'm glad that that was the path I took.
The day you left, the day you were inducted or whatever, what did your parents say to you?
There was a big rally at the Milwaukee Railroad Depot when I left for combat. The whole student body, I think everybody was there. The school band was there. The cheerleaders were there. There must have been several hundred students and faculty at the depot to see Walter Kryman, who had been the student body president, and I get on the train and head off for the Air Corps. He became a fighter pilot. I became a bomber pilot, but we were two of the better known men on campus, both of us sophomores. And everybody was celebrating. It was a kind of a festive occasion. The band was playing this peppy martial music. And then I saw my mother standing out there, tears just streaming down her face. It just broke my heart. I think my mother felt that she was looking at me possibly for the last time. And she was. She was old enough to know that it might be the last time. My father had a few tears in his eyes, and he was comforting my mother. It took some of the joy out of this festive occasion, off to war. Down we go, spouting our flames from under and so on, all the glamour. I'll never forget those scenes. When I came back after the war, a year and a half later, my father was gone. He had died at Christmas time in 1944 while I was in combat. I didn't know he had died until the cable got there 10 days after his funeral. My mother was still alive, but of course joyful to see me. We also had a little baby born to my wife while I was gone. So the homecoming was happy, but it was marred somewhat by the absence of my dad, who I never saw after that sad day when I was leaving for the Air Force.
We talked about this a little bit before. War is really a young person's game, isn't it?
War is a young person's game, particularly for pilots. You have to be a little bit on the reckless side. You have to be a little bit on the emotional side to give yourself to a hazardous operation of that kind. And you have to have incredible physical energy and physical strength. A bomber pilot sits there on a four-engine bomber. He has his right hand over 4 throttles to control those engines. He has his left hand on the steering mechanism. These big 4-engine bombers earlier on in the war were very difficult to fly physically. There was no hydraulic control system. It was like driving a Mack truck without any power steering, without any power brakes. And so you worked very hard physically for 8, 9, 10, sometimes 12 hours, holding that bomber in formation at high altitude and watching the gas. We were always short on gas by the time we got home. That took, in my opinion, the physical strength, the physical energy of a young man. And it also took the steely nerves and as I say, almost a sense of reckless abandon in order to meet that task. Yes, aerial warfare, and I think almost all kinds of warfare, requires youth and vigor and strength, no doubt about it.
You also have to believe in your own invincibility, don't you?
To a certain amount, you do have to believe in your own invincibility. There was a saying, probably doesn't make any sense, but we used to say, if it has your name on it, you're going to get it. If it doesn't, you're okay. And we always thought it didn't have our name on it, and yet the evidence was all around. We'd see a bomber off our wing flying in formation over a target, hit by an anti-aircraft shell, the bomber catching fire, then exploding when the fire hit the gas tanks, falling in pieces, no parachute seen sometimes. Or we'd see a bomber lifting on takeoff, loaded with high-octane gasoline, loaded with bombs, loaded with young men, people we'd had breakfast with before dawn, just a few minutes before, laughing and talking and betting whether the Cardinals or Yankees were going to win the World Series. And then 15, 20 minutes later, watch the plane ahead of us lift off, get a few feet off the runway, stall, crash, burn, little bits of burned flesh as big as a finger. Those memories stay with you. I thought I had forgotten all of them until Steve Ambrose wrote his book about the B-24s in World War II and made me the centerpiece of the book, my crew and me. But then those images began to come back, and it lets you know that you went through an awful lot in completing 35 missions. I frankly, in retrospect, don't know how we did it. I didn't know until I read Steve Ambrose's book, when after he did his research at the Pentagon in the Air Force records, the Army Air Corps records, I didn't know that half of the bombers, the B-24s that I was flying with, never completed their missions. The crews went down sometime during the missions. In fact, the average crew never got beyond 17 missions. You were only half through at 17 missions. You had to fly another 18 after that. I'm glad I didn't know that at the time. When I got to 17, if I'd have known that that's the time most crews ended up, it would have been a lot tougher to fly the remaining 18. You do obviously think, gosh, this could have just as easily been our plane that went down. And there's a certain amount of truth in that. You can't control the anti-aircraft gunners that are shooting at you from 25,000 feet below. That's 5 miles away. They're probably on radar. And whether they hit the first plane in the formation or the 17th plane, a lot of that is just sheer luck, sheer fate. So you do imagine you could absorb a anti-aircraft hit. I absorbed a lot of them. The last mission we flew, we had over 110 shrapnel holes in our airplane. Why? It didn't hit a gas tank or knock out the engines or break off the tail on the plane. It's to a certain extent just fate. So you do have those thoughts, but I always worked at putting that out of my mind and concentrating on the missions we had to fly that day and in subsequent days. And I think I pretty well conquered my any paralysis that might have resulted from fearing that I might be the next one to be hit. But you can't fly a bombing mission against a heavily defended target without knowing that you may never come back. It can happen to anybody. Or you can stall on takeoff. You can be overloaded. You can slide on a slippery taxi strip. Lots of things can happen to you in a bomber. Some planes went down because of bad weather. Some got lost from the mission and ran out of gas. Any number of things that can hit you. So when you complete 35 combat missions, you heave one whale of a big sigh of relief. And I don't know very many people who volunteered to fly additional missions.
You at one point were hit by shrapnel, or your plane was, and blew out the windshield?
It was on the 6th mission, maybe the 7th. I guess it was the 7th mission. I had seen the anti-aircraft shells exploding all around us. You'd see these great black clouds that would, and usually in the middle, a red flash of fire when the shell exploded. But none of them had hit us in the first 6 missions. So you saw the flak and just figured that's part of the mission. On the 7th, a shell exploded ahead of the nose of our airplane. A piece of shrapnel about that size tore through the middle of that windshield and struck a large steel girder just over the head of the co-pilot sitting on my right and myself. This girder was across our head. It smashed into that girder and fell on the floor in front of the engineer who was standing up between the two of us. It could have taken off the head of either the co-pilot or mine if it had been 8 or 10 inches left or right, or the engineer if it had been 8 or 10 inches lower. From that time on, I knew we were in war. that this was not just flying around in the wild blue yonder and looking at the puffs of smoke, that was real ammunition out there. I carried that piece of shrapnel with me the rest of the war and brought it back to the States. Somebody stole it one day as a souvenir.
Did you ever doubt the reason for being there? Did you ever doubt that this was a moral war that you were involved in?
I never doubted the purposes and the essential character of the American involvement in that war. We had to fight in World War II. We were attacked not only at Pearl Harbor, but Hitler was gobbling up one country after another in Europe. He'd have taken the whole European continent. Obviously, the Red Army stopped him in his eastward push. Some 22 million Russians died in that effort, but they killed 6 million of Hitler's crack troops. That broke his back on the Eastern Front, and the Americans and the British coming in from the West defeated him on the Western flank. But I never doubted the necessity of stopping Hitler's war machine. I never doubted the necessity of standing up to the Japanese and Mussolini's Italy. All three of those countries are now allies of ours. Not so 55 years ago at the time we entered World War II. I think if the United States had not entered that war, the Allies would have lost. Hitler would have reigned over Europe, and God knows what that could have meant to the American future.
Can we stop a moment and raise the
Microphone a little bit more this way. Just gonna raise it up just a little bit. Okay. You and your wife had decided not to marry before you left, but then you went ahead and married. Could you describe that process?
Well, I met Eleanor while we were in college. We were freshmen. We had a few dates. I walked across the campus one day and took her hand. It was in April of 1941. And just the touching of hands, I knew I was in love with that girl. I suppose that sounds kind of tame by today's standards, but from that point on, we dated steadily until the war took me away. We got engaged just before I left home, but we decided we should wait until after the war. After I'd been in training for a while, we decided that we'd get married when I got my wings. I graduated from flying school. Finally, we decided, why wait? So we got married at the end of primary training. I hitchhiked home to Mitchell, South Dakota. My father presided at the wedding ceremony. That night, we went back to the flying field in Muskogee, Oklahoma. We sat up all night on a troop train, crying children, weary young mothers, soldiers. For some time, there was no place to sit down. So we sat on our suitcases. That was our honeymoon. I had to fly the next morning at 6 o'clock in Muskogee, Oklahoma. Those wartime marriages weren't supposed to last. It's a wonder ours didn't crack up on the honeymoon. But we've been stumbling along for 60 years now, and it's worked out just fine. 5 children, wonderful youngsters, and now with children of their own. So things worked out fine for us.
You flew the B-24, which is one of the most difficult aircraft that there are to fly. Could you describe what the particular challenges were with that?
The B-24 was then the biggest airplane in the Air Force, 110-foot wingspan compared to 103 for the B-17, the so-called Super Fortress. It was difficult physically because the controls were stiff until we got the hydraulic controls late in the war. That changed everything then, much easier to fly. It had a narrow Davis wing, as it was called. It frankly was a more difficult airplane to fly than any other bomber in the service. But it also had great strengths. It could fly further than the B-17. It could carry a heavier bomb load. And those two things alone led the Air Force to produce more of that bomber than any other plane during the war. We even produced more B-24s than we did any single fighter plane. It was the most produced airplane in the Second World War, and probably had more to do with destroying Hitler's oil supply, his oil refineries in Eastern Europe and in Germany itself than any other airplane. So it paid a crucial part in the destruction of the Nazi war machine. By the end of the war, he couldn't keep his fighter planes in the air, not enough fuel. He couldn't run his tanks. Some of the heavy artillery were pulled by horses at the end of the war. So the B-24 was a crucial factor in Hitler's defeat. I can't speak about the Asiatic theater because I don't know as much about it.
There was at the time a big debate between the Americans and the British about whether the targets that should be targeted were strategic things such as train lines and bridges, or I think it was Tui Spots who wanted to go after the refineries, because if you got the oil, they couldn't do anything. Mm-hmm. Were you guys privy to that at all on your level? Or?
We were. We did hear about the argument as to what the proper role of the strategic bomber was. The American Air Force decided that our function should be to hit carefully selected strategic targets: oil refineries, tank factories, airplane factories, railway marshalling yards, and that's what we concentrated on. The British loaded up those big Lancaster bombers, and they did all of their bombing at night. They would simply fly up over Berlin, see the lights, open the bomb bays, and drop the bombs. They didn't know what they were hitting down below. We didn't always hit our targets either, but we did daytime precision bombing with the use of the Norden bomb sight, and I think our record was pretty good. We sometimes missed the target. Human beings make errors. Our calculations were sometimes off. When you drop a bomb from 5 miles up with a forward speed of maybe 300 miles an hour, it takes a lot of factoring to make sure those bombs eventually end up on the target. But I think the strategic bombing of the United States was the right way to do it. It was certainly more humane than simply dumping bombs on large urban areas.
At one point, you actually dropped a bomb on a farmhouse and were torn by guilt for a long time?
I was. It was, we had hit the Skoda ammunition works in Czechoslovakia that day, and we were hit over the target. We lost one engine at first, and then another went out on the way back, so I dropped out of formation. It was a bright, sunshiny day, and the crew in the bomb bay told me that one of the live bombs had lodged in the bomb rack. We had 10 500-pound bombs. 9 of them dropped. 1 of them was dangling somehow. I said, well, you guys got to get rid of that bomb. I'm not going to land this plane with a loose bomb dangling in the bomb base. So if you don't get rid of it before we get back to our home base, I'm going to have to fly out over the Adriatic, and we're going to have to drop that, we're going to have to get rid of that bomb or bail out. Well, they kept working on it, and we came down quite a few thousand feet, and right at high noon, it broke loose just over the Austria-Italian border. And it was a clear day, and you could see what happened. It hit right in the middle of a little Austrian farmyard. People that doubtless thought they were safely out of the war zone. The buildings just took off in all directions. And I thought, gosh, you know, that's too bad. Probably a family that might not even be involved in the war at all. I told that story years later on Austrian television. They had asked me to be a guest on a program they were doing on Austria in World War II. And I said, I've regretted that all these years. That night, an old Austrian farmer called the television station and said, tell the American senator who was on television tonight that that was my farm. I know because it was right at high noon. It was right in the area where he said, but we saw that lone bomber coming, and we got our family out of the house. We hid in a ditch. Nobody was hurt. And furthermore, I hated Adolf Hitler. So if bombing my farm ended that war 1 minute earlier, tell the senator not to worry about it. So I got redeemed after all these years. I don't mean I'd been brooding about it for 40 years, but I certainly thought about it a good many times and wished it hadn't happened. By the way, I learned about the birth of my child the same day I learned I'd hit that farmhouse. And I thought, gosh, Eleanor and I have brought a new child into the world. She's 5,000 miles away, of course, back in South Dakota. The same day I probably killed somebody else's children. It was a bad scene.
At that point, are you old enough? Do you have the maturity? Because you're in your early 20s at that point. Obviously, you thought about it, but I mean, how do you reconcile all that? Or don't you? Don't you even try to during wartime?
You don't try really to reconcile. You know deep inside when you're dropping demolition bombs on a strategic target, you know that there's going to be some collateral damage, as we now call it, where you might hit a hospital, you might hit a cathedral that's nearby, you might hit a school. You just don't know. You bomb a railway marshalling yards. Half of those railway cars might be filled with civilians. You just don't know those things, so you don't brood about it. You figure, as General Sherman said, and I even thought about this, I was then a history major, Sherman said, war is hell. It is hell. It's hell on the civilians, it's hell on the soldiers. So you can't brood about that too much, or you'd lose your sanity. And I didn't brood about it. I thought about winning the war, knocking the Nazis out of the war, and that's what you concentrated on, winning, not worrying about who had been accidentally killed. But I kept thinking about that farmhouse and all those buildings blowing. That stayed with me for quite a while until I finally got relief 40 years later. I'm smiling now because it was a happy ending.
You had mentioned briefly earlier the Davis Wing, which was a classic good news, bad news situation. What was the Davis Wing?
The Davis Wing was so narrow, you had to, it was, as I say, it was 110 feet long, but it was so narrow you had to look at it and you wondered, how can that narrow wing lift a bomber that's going to weigh 60,000 pounds at takeoff with the crew and the gasoline and the ammunition, bombs and everything. It was designed by a man by the name of Davis, and when the Air Force first looked at it, they were skeptical it would work, but it worked magnificently. Now, I will have to say this, when you had that Davis wing lifting a 60,000-pound loaded bomber off the ground, and you only had 5,000 feet, most runways today at commercial airports are 10 or 12,000 feet, you used every foot of that runway every time you took off. And if you pulled it off too fast, you were in trouble. You probably crashed in the first grove of trees beyond the runway. Let me put it to you this way. I never made a takeoff in World War II, fully loaded with bombs, men, and high-octane gasoline, thousands of gallons of gasoline, without sweating out the takeoff. I sweated out most of the landings too, but it was a lot safer than most of those takeoffs.
Did you feel a particular responsibility, obviously, because you were the pilot?
I knew every minute that I was in the air, that I was taking off, that I was landing. I knew that not only my life, but the lives of 9 other young guys, most of them younger than I was, were at stake. Yes, you feel that very heavily. It's one of the reasons that bomber pilots probably fly a little more deliberately, a little more cautiously than fighter pilots who worry only about one pilot themselves and the guy they're trying to knock out of the sky. So yes, a bomber pilot, just like a commercial airline pilot today, always has in mind that there are lives of other people on the line.
You were escorted on some of the missions by the Tuskegee Airmen?
We were. I remember the first mission the Tuskegee Airmen flew when they defended us. There'd been all these rumors that black pilots don't have good coordination, that they're not intelligent enough, all that nonsense. Tell that to Michael Jordan, that black pilots aren't as well coordinated as the whites. They flew brilliantly. They performed well. They were well trained. They were the cream of the crop. They'd been hand-picked by the Air Corps, partly because the Air Corps was aware of the prejudice and discrimination against black people that existed at that stage in our history. They knew that these men had to work overtime to prove their equality, their worth, their effectiveness, and they achieved that. I think every white pilot who was escorted by black airmen knew that we were being protected by very brave, very well-trained, very skillful, intelligent young men. I can't say too much good about the Tuskegee Airmen.
In terms of your own training, did you feel like that you were well trained and the other pilots were well trained?
I felt that we were well trained. I think the Army Air Corps did a wonderful job, as did the Navy Air Corps, in training pilots. I later came to understand that we had more training time than the Nazi German pilots, more training time than the Japanese Zero pilots had. We had excellent instructors. They worked with us to iron out the kinks. They washed out pilots that they thought for one reason or other weren't going to be able to stay the course. A lot of people were washed out of training, and they later became navigators or bombardiers or gunners or some other role in the Air Force. You had to have excellent eyesight, excellent depth perception, good coordination. You had to have a steady, stable temperament. And the Air Force worked hard to weed out the people that didn't have those qualities. Yes, I felt we were well trained. I never had a superior officer, superior in rank, that was not a good officer. There's a lot of jokes about the terrible officers. Those Army Air Corps officers that we had were, in my opinion, first rate, without exception.
War's over with. You come back, you take up being a history professor?
We had this great GI Bill, I think one of the most wonderful programs the federal government ever devised, and it offered any GI returning from the war the opportunity to go to any college of his or her choice. You could go all the way through to a PhD, which is what I did. I had most of my undergraduate work, so I went to Northwestern University on Lake Michigan, the edge of Chicago, and went straight through for 4 years led to a PhD in history. It was one of the greatest things in my life. It permitted me to not only become a professor, but some years later to enter public service as a congressman, a senator, even a presidential candidate. That may be enough to convince some people the GI Bill was a bad idea. It gave us George McGovern as a presidential contender. But I loved it. I profited from it. I owe the American people a great debt for financing my higher education after World War II.
Why do you think, and I'll go back to some of the World War II stuff afterwards, but why do you think so many of you pilots, World War II era pilots, people like you and Joe Foss and John Glenn and others, then went into public service, went into public office?
I think we went into public office for the same reasons we went into the war, which was to serve the public, to serve the nation. I always had that in mind. Every day I was in public life, I was every bit as conscientious to serve what I thought was the public interest as I was to serve the public in the Second World War. It was a different kind of challenge. But I can honestly tell you that while I made my share of mistakes, both in the war and in peacetime service, we all make mistakes, we all make errors in judgment. I tried to the best of my ability, both in war and peace, to serve the national interest. That was always the guiding influence in my public life.
Also, I guess pilots are natural leaders in a way.
I think so. I think there was something about the wartime experience, especially in the case of bomber pilots with a crew to command, that made us feel that we had some qualities of leadership. We earned the confidence and devotion of our crews, no question about it. I have never doubted that that crew, by the end of the war, literally was in love with the pilot. After all, their lives had been in my hands for a year. And so I think that encouraged the view that maybe you could lead other people in a public enterprise.
You were a young congressman, first-term congressman, running for a second term. You ran against Joe Foss.
I did. I was the first Democrat elected in Republican South Dakota in a quarter of a century. And I came up for election the first time, and Governor Joe Foss, he'd then been our governor, and a very popular governor, and a good man, he was urged by his party to take George McGovern out of there. And so he ran against me in my second try for Congress. I was elected the first time rather handily, and I thought this is going to be the acid test, running against a Congressional Medal of Honor winner who was also governor of the state. But Joe and I had a good, clean campaign. Neither one of us ever threw any mud at the other. There never really was a cross word in that campaign, and I won the election, and the voters of South Dakota sent me back for a second term in the Congress. Joe went on to become football commissioner of the American Football League. So both of us ended up happy, and we've been friends ever since.
Going back to World War II, overseas, you were assigned over at San Giovanni Field, Cerignola. What is Cerignola? It sounds beautiful. What was the reality?
Cerignola then was a very impoverished, war-torn village. It's now a city of about 60,000 people. Then it was a small town shortly off the Adriatic Sea. It was an olive growing area, a wine and grape growing area. It grew some grain. Our squadron was located in tents that we pitched in an Italian olive grove. You attached the four corners with ropes to four sturdy trees, 4 officers in a tent, 6 enlisted men on the crew in another tent. We lived that way for a year near Cerignola. We'd go into town once in a while, get to know some of the townspeople. But Italy was a very grim place in World War II. What damage Mussolini and the fascists had not done to the country, the Germans who occupied it, and later the British and Americans fighting their way up the peninsula, between those 3 armies and the squeeze of the war, Italy was a very unhappy place. Lots of hunger and poverty and disease in Italy during the war. I remember the first time I became interested in the global hunger issue. Our troop ship pulled into Naples harbor in the late summer of 1944. And as we came into that docking area, you could see hundreds of children lined up on either side of the dock, and they were yelling at us, children. Butterfingers, Baby Rouge, Wrigley's Gum, Coca-Cola. Those were the English words they knew best. As the ship moved a little closer, the commander came on the loudspeaker. He said, "Do not throw anything to those children on that docking area. This is war-torn Italy, and those children are near starvation." Yesterday, a troop ship came in here, and the GIs started throwing candy bars and things. Some of it fell in the water, and 24 children drowned fighting for these bits of food. That was my introduction to human hunger. We used to wake up sometimes to young Italian mothers scratching through our garbage dumps, looking for bits of food to take home for their children. Sometimes you'd see the same young women on the streets that night selling themselves to American GIs for a few dollars. It was a tragic situation. It gave me a lifelong interest of concern for people in trouble, people who are hungry, people in poverty.
On one of your takeoffs, you blew a tire. You knew you would have to do a crash landing, but you went ahead with the mission anyway?
Yes, that was about, I'd say maybe the 12th or 13th mission. It was fairly early, certainly in the first third of my missions. I opened the throttles wide open, and we roared down the runway. We got about halfway down, and the right tire blew. Just two major wheels on a B-24 bar, and then you have the little nose wheel, which is used in taxi. I didn't know what to do, whether to try to jam on the brakes. All this, keep in mind, this decision is made in a split second, but you still have time to think, shall I hit the brakes or shall I keep the throttles open and pull this plane off the ground? I decided we couldn't stop with one tire blowing, that if I hit the brakes, it would lurch to that side to the point where we'd tear off a wing and maybe explode. So I just kept the throttles wide open. I had to correct for the drag on that wheel by advancing the throttles a little more on that side and cutting the power a little bit on the left side. We got to the end of the runway. We weren't quite at takeoff speed. I pulled it off anyway. And I don't know how far we flew before we started to gain altitude. And slowly but surely, I could see the treetops, looked like they were going to hit the undercarriage. We began to climb, and I knew we were in the clear. Then the question is, what do you do with a wheel off on one side? How are you going to land? So I called the tower and asked for instructions. And they said, well, Lieutenant, it's up to you. You can turn around and make a landing on one wheel. We wouldn't advise that. You're loaded with bombs, you're loaded with gasoline. You can go on the mission, burn up most of your gasoline, drop your bombs, and then come back, and you can make a decision then whether to bail out or try to land on one wheel. I decided to try to land on one wheel. I told the crew, I said, any of you guys want to bail out, it's fine. There won't be any admonition from me one way or the other. And they said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to take this plane in. All 9 of them said, we're going to go with you. You know, this has to be a certain amount of luck. It was the best landing I ever made in my life. I set that plane down with such ease. It just, you could hardly hear the wheel hit the ground, just sort of a little swishing sound. And that plane just floated to a start. I had again advanced the engines on the right side to compensate for the drag, and then as the bomber slowed, I gradually took the power off. I never made a better landing in World War II. It was one of the reasons I was put in for the Distinguished Flying Cross, although I got that later for another landing that I made on the Isle of Viz.
There's nothing that they can do to train you for something like that. That is the ultimate test, really.
The only thing they train you for is if you lose an engine on one side, they train you how to advance the throttle so you compensate for the engine drag on the side that's dead, but or the engine that's dead. But I never had any training in what to do if a wheel comes off or you blow a tire, which is almost the same thing.
As you get closer and closer to that 35th mission, that golden 35th mission, do you start getting superstitious? Do you handle things differently? Do you play it safe? What do you do?
You just have to treat it like any other mission. Obviously, if you had some way of knowing you'd go down on the 35th mission, you'd figure out some reason not to go. Pilots never had to fly a mission. They could absolutely say, I am not flying today, and they'd give you an excuse. You probably also got a black mark on your record, but I never was tempted once not to fly a mission when it was my turn to fly. So I think by then we had the momentum going. We knew the United States was going to win the war, And I didn't feel any special fear about that 35th mission. I have to tell you, it was probably the worst mission of the war for us. That was the one where we got over 100 holes torn in the fuselage of that big airplane. We came back without any brakes. The hydraulic system was shot out. We had no flaps to slow the landing speed. We couldn't put the gear down automatically. We had to crank it down laboriously by hand. And then we had this riddled old tub that we somehow had to keep together until we got to the landing field.
After you completed
By the way, I also on that last mission had a man hit with a piece of shrapnel. It entered just below his knee and followed all the way up to his leg, to his buttocks. And he was badly hurt. Tex Ashlock, a big 6'2" gunner in the back of the airplane. Sadly enough, we had to leave him in Italy. He couldn't leave the hospital when the rest of us came back to the States. I remember him crying, this great big Texan. I remember him crying when I reached over and gave him a hug. I almost was tempted not to go home and to stay with him until he got out of the hospital. But my wife had given birth to a little child I had never seen. She was then several months old, and that swung me in the direction of saying goodbye to Tex. And of course, he arrived a month or so after the rest of us.
That's the bond that you developed with the crew that you would consider staying around until he was ready to go?
Oh, absolutely. I loved every member of that crew, and just as they loved me. That's the only word I can use. There was also a great feeling of dependence that we had on each other. But yes, we were bonded. We were 10 men who knew our lives depended on teamwork and on the proficiency of the other members of the crew. I had a great co-pilot. He wanted to be a fighter pilot in the worst way, but he wasn't allowed to be that, and he became my co-pilot. He was a brilliant flyer, and thank God for that. He could sometimes, when we were on formation, take over for a while and give me a rest, and he'd hold that airplane in there in tight formation just as well as I could.
Excuse me. In 1972, when you ran for president, most Americans were not aware of your war record, and that was pretty much a decision that you made not to publicize that, wasn't it?
I found it awkward, frankly, to talk about my war record. It almost seemed like boasting. And I thought, well, most people that are interested probably know that I was a combat pilot. It isn't that I was totally silent about it. I once in a while would tell an audience about bringing a plane home on a difficult mission. But I never made a big thing in paid advertising about what a great war hero I was. It wasn't until Professor Ambrose got hold of me 50 years after the war and wrote that great book, The Wild Blue, and he got me talking about the war where I was relating things I thought I had forgotten. He was a brilliant interrogator, and he got the whole story there in that book he wrote, a best-selling book. And since then, I've found it rather easy to talk to people about World War II. I think at long last I'm free of some of the unhappy memories. I still mourn all the pilots that went down, the crews, the people that were lost. Yes, I still mourn them. I still am very cautious about committing young men to warfare unless it's absolutely necessary in the national interest of this great country that we all love. Don't send young men to die unless you know what you're doing.
Would you have had the same perspective if you did not have that military background?
I think the military background has given me a greater measure of caution about committing youngsters to battle than I otherwise would have had. When I hear these people beating on their chests saying, support our troops, the best way to support our troops is not to send them into unnecessary danger, into unnecessary wars. Of course we support our troops. Have you ever seen some Americans stand up saying, I don't support our troops? But if you really support America's young men, don't be careless about committing them to unnecessary death and unnecessary warfare.
Was World War II the last moral war that we've been in, do you think?
World War II was the last war that I was absolutely certain about. Uh, Korea, probably second in line. We never should have gone into Vietnam. A disastrous mistake, and I knew that almost from the first year we were involved there as a brand new senator. I think that we have fought conflicts since then. I question the necessity of invading Iraq. We haven't yet found the weapons of mass destruction, but in any event, I didn't think that was an essential war. I'm glad we prevailed, but I thought it was not essential to the American national interest. You know, the old English conservative Edmund Burke, when he was a member of Parliament, he said, "A conscientious man will be cautious how he deals in blood." That's what I think. We want to be very cautious about committing our grandsons, young men of this country, or young women, to a conflict unless it's absolutely in the national interest of the United States.
But it would be a mistake to think of you as a pacifist.
Oh, I'm not a pacifist. If we had a challenge like we did with Hitler and the Japanese in World War II, I'd volunteer again if I had the strength to do it. I guess they wouldn't take me at the age of 80, but my impulse would be there. Any time the survival of the American people in our democracy is on the line, I'm ready to use force to protect this country. But I'm also ready to be cautious and know deep in my soul that this is a war we have to fight in the security and national interest of the United States before I'll sacrifice one young American life.
When you look back on it, do you think to yourself how incredible it is what your generation, what you and your crew and all your colleagues were able to do at such an incredibly young age?
I do indeed. In retrospect, I don't know how so many millions of young Americans laid their lives on the line, both in the air, on the ground, and at sea, and pulled it off. We won a war against an enemy that was much better equipped at the beginning of the war than we were, and we came from behind and defeated the Axis powers and did it fair and square. I think it was an enormous achievement. Probably the Great Depression and World War II were the forges in which that generation was hardened like steel for the struggles that faced us.
Is that old expression that doesn't kill you makes you stronger? Do you believe that?
I do believe that. I think that meeting a difficult test, not yielding, does make you stronger, both in meeting, for example, the Great Depression of the 20s and 30s and meeting the test of war in the 1940s. I think it made our generation stronger than we otherwise would have been.
If we were to face a Hitler today, do you think we would have the same resolve?
I think we still have young people who are capable of meeting that kind of a challenge. I've always had faith in the young people of America. They may be different than our generation. They've probably had it easier growing up. On the other hand, they've had some temptations and difficulties to overcome that we didn't have so much of 50 years ago. We didn't have the drug problem in this country. We didn't have the degree of alcoholism when we were coming through. We didn't have the danger of too much affluence. I remember somebody writing an article, the difficulty of growing up rich. You know, there's some hazards that go with that. We didn't have to worry about being too rich or having it too easy, and in that sense, those difficulties were almost an advantage to us.
Several years ago, you had a daughter who you love very much who died from alcoholism. and you wrote a book about it and you went public with it. Why did you do that, sir?
That was the saddest chapter of my life by far. Terry McGovern was a wonderful young woman, a delightful, intelligent, humane, compassionate, witty person. She could crack me up, drunk or sober, when she was in those conditions. But she was an alcoholic. She was terribly addicted to alcohol. She fought that all of her adult life, in and out of programs, in and out of the AA, counselors, reading the Bible, reading the books of Eastern wisdom, all those things. She fought that malady tooth and nail. In the end, after she got out of the treatment centers, one night she had sworn, never again will I take a drink. This is it. I've got two wonderful little girls. I'm never again. That night, a Vietnam veteran who was a friend of hers said, Terry, let's have one Christmas toast before you go off to join your parents in Washington, D.C. Let's just have one. 3 hours later, when the bartender refused to serve her any longer, she wandered out into a Wisconsin snowstorm, stumbled about a half a block, fell into a alleyway, and froze to death. They found her body the next day about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, frozen hard. It's the worst thing that can happen to you in life, to lose one of your kids, and it doesn't make any difference whether they're 5 years old or 45. In fact, the longer they've been around, the more shared history, the more memories, the more laughs, the more tears you recall. It was terrible. And I'm frank to say it just about did me in, more than flying 35 combat missions in World War II. I wrote a book about it because I didn't want this death to be in vain. I didn't want her life to be in vain. I wanted to tell people what a wonderful person she was, and yet how that addiction, which is a medical illness of the first rank, how it killed her, and the danger to other young people. I worry about binge drinking on the part of young people these days, on the campuses and elsewhere. Not that they're all alcoholics. I'm not a teetotaler myself, but I worry about excessive drinking that can take you over the line into alcoholism. I think heredity has a lot to do with this. That's why I wrote that book. I'm glad that I did. I have always hoped that in God's good time that someday I'll learn why Terry died. I think I know the reasons. I think she was overcome by a malady she couldn't surpass. That test to her was more difficult than overcoming German anti-aircraft fire in World War II. And she went down.
So courage comes in many different forms?
Courage comes in many different forms. It certainly does. It took a lot of courage for me as a freshman senator to stand up on the floor of the United States Senate in 1963. I'd only been in the Senate about 8 months, and to make my first speech warning against our deepening involvement in Vietnam. President Kennedy, my dear friend, was then President of the United States. But I thought we were on the wrong course. I continued my criticism in the Johnson administration. I continued it for 4 years in the Nixon administration. So it didn't make any difference to me whether presidents were Democrats or Republicans. I felt that war was mistaken and that we were needlessly sacrificing brave young Americans in a war we never should have entered. I felt that way then. I feel that way today.
You saw that 7th grade gym teacher now. What would you tell him about courage?
I would tell that 7th grade gym teacher never to tell a youngster, particularly in front of his classmates, that he's a coward. I knew deep in my soul I wasn't a coward, but I also knew that I'd been humiliated by a man we all admired. I heard Joe say some other things later in life that I thought were ill-advised. Too much harsh profanity, cursing out football players, basketball players. I don't hold that against him. I just think that it showed a certain amount of immaturity on his part.
How would you like to be remembered?
I'd like to be remembered as a man who did everything he could to serve America, both in time of war and in time of peace. Not as a man free of mistakes, but a man who did his best as he saw it to serve this country.
Thank you very much, sir.